Everyone, in this video lecture, we are covering the topic all about photosynthesis. All right, so what we need to talk about before we can talk about the steps of photosynthesis is cellular energy. So that is the goal of the processes that we're going to be talking about, is how to make energy in the form of ATP. Well, no matter what kind of organism you are, every living thing must have some form of energy in order to do basic functions within their cells. And to do that, all living things need a form of carbohydrate, usually in the form of glucose. So, glucose enters the mitochondria. We're going to learn about a process called cellular respiration later on. And through cellular respiration happening in your mitochondria, ATP or cellular energy is created. So, the question becomes, where do organisms get that glucose? How do they have that source of carbohydrates to make ATP? So, in autotrophs, organisms that make their own food, they use the solar energy from the sun to make their own carbs. That is what we're going to be talking about today. How organisms that are autotrophs, like plants, are able to make their own carbs using sun. We're later going to learn about other types of organisms called heterotrophs. Heterotrophs cannot make their own carbohydrates, so they must eat other organisms that contain carbs. So in this lesson, we're focusing on autotrophs. They're going to basically use a process to create their own glucose. So for plants, these are the autotrophs that we were referring to. That first step of creating ATP involves creating their own carbohydrates. So, step one for plants to get energy is to go through photosynthesis. After they've created their own carbohydrates, they will then go on to use that glucose that they create for cellular respiration. And we'll talk about that later on. So, photosynthesis is that process that plants use to make glucose. And this process is occurring in the chloroplast, which is why when we learned about cell organelles, we referred to the chloroplast as the glucose factory. So there are reactants and products. Think of this as an equation, or ingredients that go into the process. We'll talk about each of these. And then the output is that glucose that we're creating. So in order for photosynthesis to occur in your chloroplast, you need 6 water molecules. So 6 H2O, H2O being water. You also need 6 carbon dioxide molecules. So plants will need to take in carbon dioxide from the air, and they need sunlight. And if they have these ingredients in the right proportions, they can make one single glucose molecule, or C6H12O6. They also, as a byproduct, create 6 oxygen gas molecules. So you need water, carbon dioxide, light, and the output is making glucose with the byproduct of oxygen gas. So, how plants are able to do this? The first thing that we need to understand is the basic structure of a leaf, or part of the plant. And so, on plant leaves, they have these little openings called stomata, and they're very important because this is what allows different gases in and out of the plant for photosynthesis to occur. So, for example, when the stomata are open, carbon dioxide can get into the plant for photosynthesis, as well as oxygen and water are able to then leave the plant. So, where all of this is occurring is actually in the chloroplast of the plant cell. So, if we were to zoom in on a single plant cell, we'd see that plant cells have many, many chloroplasts. And that is what's actually giving plants their green color, because there's some green pigment we'll talk about in a minute. So, the chloroplast is this structure with what look like little pancakes inside of it. We call those little stacks of pancakes. Each one is a thylakoid, and that is going to be an important site for where photosynthesis occurs. So the reason your chloroplast is green in color is it has a pigment called chlorophyll. That pigment, the green color, is embedded in the thylakoid membranes. So each little pancake looking thing here is called a thylakoid, and it has its own membrane, like a cell membrane, and embedded in that membrane is clusters of that pigment. So that makes the chloroplast very green in color, and because plant cells have so many chloroplasts, it makes the plant look green. And that pigment is truly what is absorbing the sunlight in order to do the process of photosynthesis. So there are two main steps of photosynthesis. The first step is known as the light-dependent reaction, also known as the light reactions. So obviously light is a required component for the first half of photosynthesis. The second step is called the light independent reaction, aka the dark reaction, or it's also known as the Kelvin cycle, named after the person who discovered it. So in this second half of photosynthesis steps, light is not required. So we'll go through what's happening at each of these steps. So in your light dependent reaction, you need two ingredients. So for this step to occur in photosynthesis, you need sunlight, hence why it's called the light dependent reaction, and you need water. Both of these ingredients or reactants enter into the chloroplast, and what we create with them via the thylakoid of the chloroplast is we create some ATP. We also create another molecule called NADPH. You don't really need to know too much about that other than it just carries these things called electrons, which is helpful when we're trying to make energy. And this is where oxygen is created as a waste product. So oxygen will leave the chloroplast and leave the plant entirely, and that's adding oxygen into the atmosphere. So this is happening within those thylakoids of your chloroplast. Again, those little stacks of pancakes. So we made some ATP, but again, the goal of photosynthesis is not to make ATP. So that ATP as well as the NADPH are going to be important for the next part of photosynthesis. So the next part is that light independent reaction. So the products that we just created, the ATP as well as the NADPH, those are necessary in combination with CO2. So this is where the plant is using that carbon dioxide it breathes in. And what it creates through these series of steps is glucose. So the ATP is not a product. It gets used up in the formation of creating glucose. And this is happening in what we call the stroma of the chloroplast, which is really just kind of the open space inside of the chloroplast. Think of it kind of like the cytoplasm, but that's the inside space of the chloroplast. So the Kelvin cycle involves multiple steps in order to take the ATP, NADPH, and CO2 to convert it into glucose. So then once photosynthesis is done and plants have created glucose, which is their source of carbohydrates, that glucose will then enter the next phase of cellular respiration where it will be used to create more ATP energy.